Welcome to Psychologist Talks. Today's going to be the first episode in what I hope is a series about masculinity. In this first episode, all I'm trying to do is speak real briefly to the status of masculinity. What's the history behind that status? How did we get to where we're at, essentially? How are we doing in the present day? And then maybe what could we do about it? Now, I'm not going to have any grand answers for that last point, but I'll at least kind of comment on some of the sticking points in the present day. So let's just rip off the Band-Aid. What is the status, the current status? In brief, I think we're in a status of crisis. And we've been that way for several decades. I mean, if you really want to telescope out about how masculinity has been encountered throughout time and throughout history, we've probably been in crisis for hundreds and hundreds of years if you really look at it. But you got to be kind of careful with that, because when you do this sort of retrospective analysis, we always could have done better. So I think when I say the last several decades, it's probably the most accurate, because it's when there's been the most amount of discourse about masculinity and maybe that there's a healthier version out there. And yet we have not done a good job in these last several decades, I think, of really narrowing focus and coming out the other side with a healthier version of masculinity. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. A lot of things take time, but again, that gets to the final point, is like we could be doing better. And I'll talk about why and how I think we could be doing better. So, why is there a state of crisis? Well, I think in many ways, masculinity has and continues to be a one-dimensional construct. We don't really think about masculinity through, how can I say this, a more dimensional lens. And when we trace the history, you'll kind of hear this. There tends to be this sort of one-trick pony ideology around masculinity, which does a huge disservice. Identity is usually most healthy when there's flexibility within it, which is kind of point number two, one-dimensional and lack of flexibility. When you have more options, when there's more kind of sub-factors to a construct, and that there's flexibility in how people can identify with, say, masculinity, typically the healthier it gets. And we've been stuck here, I think, for a pretty darn long time, and we do need to get out of it. So let's first, though, before we go through the history, where we're at today, and maybe what we could do, just a quick note that this is a very gendered construct. So you'll often hear me talking through the lens of men. But in reality, and ever since the dawn of the whole concepts of masculinity and femininity, which is a gendered construct, right? It's baked right into the name. Masculinity, men, femininity, women. That's part and parcel to it. But like any construct that kind of describes our identity, it doesn't have to be a gender construct. We understand the history and the evolution of the construct. But especially as you advance further and further in society, we can become more abstract with these concepts. And with that abstraction is this sort of realization that even when we were strictly men and women, there is no other option in history. Everybody had varying degrees of masculinity and femininity inside of them. I mean, again, it's an abstract idea. Ancient Chinese philosophy talks about the yin and the yang. These are, parts that complement one another, that taken together create a greater whole. And so this has always been the case. But it makes the conversation, I guess what I'm saying, it makes it kind of challenging, because I'm going to talk about it often through a gendered lens. But do note, if I poured ahead to where are we heading? Well, the goal is that you can have any varying degree of either, and that's a totally okay, if not incredibly healthy thing. So hopefully that makes sense. I just want to be respectful that as we launch into conversations about masculinity, it will more often focus, and I will use language around men. But at the end of the day, we're talking about a construct accessible to anybody. So I'm walking through history, but that is, and I'm not going to bury the lead. The end result here is equity. The end result is equity. I'll probably talk about that again later. So let's go down history lane. History lane. Why does that sound wrong? I don't think that's a phrase, but historically, let's just go through the story of history first. This, again, doesn't sound right. History lane. So the annals of history. So if we look historically, it is a very simple equation here. Is who has dictated most of history? Who has had the most influence on history? Well, the answer is going to be men. And unequivocally, there should be no challenge or question around this, as men have dictated history. And as human beings, psychologically, we're always looking to like whoever has power and whoever has positionality within that power helps define whatever it is that we're seeing, right? So we're always looking through the lens of kind of social comparison to understand like, okay, so this is what men are or do. And by proxy, essentially, history is also teaching men predominantly, but all of society, like what masculinity means then too. And they maybe weren't using those terms. I shouldn't say maybe. Obviously, we're not using those terms historically, but that's essentially what was always happening. Now, the challenge with the history and how men ruled, I will use that word. I was going to use it lightly, but I'll use it intentionally. How ruling occurred was usually through aspects of masculinity, but there was like a hyper masculinity. There was, again, this sort of one-dimensionality. It became about power and authority and control. And you just look through history, that's all of what it was about. Perhaps not coincidentally, the most peaceful times were usually the times that we would steer away from some of these hyper-masculine tendencies, and we'd have greater times of peace because we would be less preoccupied with sort of authority and control and the things that we would typically associate with masculinity, which again is only one piece of what masculinity actually is. But again, the model, the gestalt, like, yes, we had lots of different varying degrees of masculinity and femininity and leaders and, men in positions of power and authority and decision makers throughout history. But the gestalt, the overall whole, is predominantly organized around power, control, and authority, and latent to that, aggression and assertiveness, which in of themselves are not bad things, but in excess can be very challenging. At the end of the day, what this creates is a system of inequity, that you're vying for power, you're against one another. And this is the definition, it's not a precise definition, but essentially the idea of patriarchal society, right? The patriarchy is all about inequity. It's like whoever is best, whoever is most powerful, at the end of the day will succeed, rather than there are ways to collaborate. There are ways to have more equity in a system. And when you telescope out, at the end of the day, the kind of the notions of the patriarchy are part of the yin and yang. If you distill it into its kind of more healthy or just kind of normal human components, hierarchy and power you will never eliminate from human society. You cannot do that. There's always going to be some notion of a hierarchy, some notion of power differentials. And so the yang to that yin is indeed feminism and this notion of pushing towards equity. Feminism is just the movement, the name given to the movement that created this sort of counterbalancing force. And so when feminism comes along in its many iterations, rightfully pushes against patriarchal systems and tries to pull us closer to the goal, but not the destination of equity, because you're never going to get full equity. Remember what I just said. Power and hierarchy will always exist, and so you're trying to counterbalance these forces. And so feminism, while it's a trigger word apparently for a lot of people, at its core is just about like, let us push towards equity. Let us push towards qualities of being as a society that are not so preoccupied with changing the hands of power. I guess it's a proverb now, the proverbial Game of Thrones. Wait, now I'm like questioning myself. Did the Game of Thrones exist before Game of Thrones? Part of me feels like it predated it, but did it? Maybe it didn't. Anyway, I digress. So again, you have these counterbalancing forces, and rightfully feminism comes in and actually is an aid to masculinity by challenging patriarchal systems. Because it says, like, you don't have to be so preoccupied with power. We can actually move towards equity. And latent to equity is like, you don't have to be this one-dimensional construct. You don't have to define yourself solely through the lens of strict, staunch, kind of characterized masculinity. There's more to the world than that. Now, that's where we start bleeding into the present day, and just because that's the notion and the very admirable goal of feminism doesn't mean that's how it necessarily goes. And so here we get into some dialectical space, like how are we doing? Where are we landing, particularly in the last several decades? On the one hand, there has been necessary and fervent challenging of, obviously, like I said, patriarchal systems, and by proxy, masculinity. Now, here's another trigger word for a lot of folks: toxic, right? "Quote unquote toxic masculinity." Oh, it's just a buzzword. No, not necessarily. That's a, kind of a mental shortcut to speak to the history I just spoke to. The history of men and the history of masculinity is paved by lots of greatness and wonder and invention, and also a ton of tragedy, a ton of hurt, and a ton of tragedy and hurt at the hands of these unhealthy notions that kind of lurk underneath masculinity, and hence toxic masculinity. It's a thing. It exists. It's okay. It's not going to destroy you just because there's toxic masculinity out there. And so that it's a rightful challenge because, I'll go into this I think it's going to be a second episode of my history. Is like, I was not taught healthier versions of masculinity. Not because people are mean and horrible and they wanted to like suppress me or something like that. It's just we didn't, and we haven't really had a reasonable and healthy dialogue around masculinity. And so these toxic elements, when they're not exposed to the sun, they're not disinfected in some sort of way, they just kind of lurk. And they taint, and they continue to taint, as they have always tainted masculinity. They pull us away from the healthy aspects of masculinity, and move us towards something more destructive. And let me be very clear, often very self-destructive. This is not just about like, you got to do better so the rest of society benefits. This is of benefit to men or anyone who defines themselves through any predominant lens of masculinity. And remember, the end goal here is this sort of equity mindset that you can have masculine women and feminine men and mix anywhere in between, and they can all have a place in society. And simultaneously, that does not mean that everybody has to have a perfect mix. There are absolutely that people are allowed to be more skewed towards more masculinity or more femininity, and that is totally okay. Never mind, systems and institutions benefit from masculinity and femininity different. So a perfect example is when we talk about military or policing or any of those sorts of things. If I really look at history and I look at what those sorts of professions call for, a leaning towards masculinity, if not a strong lean towards masculinity, makes perfect sense. Now, could they take in aspects of femininity and actually do better? Oh, you better believe it. When you look at military psychology and effectiveness, this sort of like stoicism, I don't need anybody, is not beneficial, and that's false stoicism, but this sort of like, I'm the rock, I don't need to be interdependent on anybody. Oh, no, contrary. Like, you go and talk to anybody who's been in the military. Oh, no, it's all about teamwork. And thereby, and gender construct of what I'm about to say, like brotherhood. Like, you are a unit, you are a team, and there is intimacy in that. There's absolute intimacy in that, which feels very feminine, and yet, it is so essential and creates even a more powerful version of masculinity through this sort of construct, this sort of idea of military or policing or whatever it might be. But just as well, it can be toxic in a not very healthy direction if the masculinity that's kind of latent to those kind of systems goes unchecked. So once again, it's all beneficial that we're challenging masculinity. However, dialectics, both things can be true at the same time. However, there's been a little bit of an overextension, in my opinion. And it's not an overextension, maybe I shouldn't say overextension. There's been collateral damage that I think is very unfortunate. Now, let me telescope out for a moment and just mention that anytime social change takes hold, we have a tendency to bastardize it. I know it might be not a terribly PC word, but we truly distort the original intention. And so this is kind of the sad aspect of like feminism. It gets appropriated by people who don't even understand what the central notion is. Then when we judge an entire movement, kind of engage in tokenism of like, we just create this caricature of what feminism is, and then what happens? Well, then we delegitimize feminism and try to throw the baby out with the bathwater, which ironically is exactly the problem of what's going on with masculinity. You create a caricature out of it, and then we throw it out. Like, the truth is somewhere in between these. The truth is somewhere in between these. And so, the overextension is the folly of humankind. It is not a folly of feminism. Feminism, at its core, is talking about equity, and equity benefits masculinity. However, we look at what has happened around us over the last several decades, and society has not been terribly kind to masculinity. And I don't mean like handle with baby gloves, because remember, point one, we need to be challenged. It is right, the right, and it is important for society to challenge masculinity and challenge it starkly. But one of the first examples I was exposed to is when you look at media, and how men are depicted in media. In like the 80s and 90s, particularly like sitcoms. Let's just go something really benign, seemingly benign. And I think there was even a PBS, I don't remember if it was like a documentary or what, but they had like men and something. They were talking about masculinity, and I feel like it fell super short. But what they were kind of talking about, I think, is a while since I watched this, and the point I'm really trying to make is men were painted as one-dimensional creatures, and just at the whim of these very simple emotions, right? They're just simple people, and it it felt like when I telescope out far enough about what was going on, it was almost like kind of a dual reaction of men feeling overwhelmed by a really increasingly complicated world for them, which it needed to be, again. And so there is something about kind of falling back on the simple things. Simultaneously, though, it felt like just kind of a dig on men, and it almost like false feminism, the sort of idea of like, well, we're going to make the woman more powerful and assertive. Now, women were not always fairly treated either. They were seen as a nag and all this other stuff that was not pro-equity. But it almost felt like it was this early vestiges, or not vestiges, kind of early iterations of trying to flip the power differential here and be like, this oafish, unreliable male with this nag but powerful woman. And it's just like, okay, like that doesn't really do anybody any favors, and especially is not doing men many favors, because it reinforces this caricature that we're just these one-dimensional simpletons, right? All we care about is sex, and all we care about is sports. Just don't want to be left alone, and emotion comes up and we don't know what to do with emotion. It's like, sweet, merciful, that's exactly the problem. Like, if you look at like the challenges of masculinity, it is usually around the emotional realms and the relational realms. Like, we're not the best at encountering emotions because we're not taught how to do that terribly well. And relationally, there's this staunch emphasis on independence, or this kind of social comparison that can sure create more simple relationships in some ways, but also creates a lot of emptiness in relationships. And so then we're going to go into media and just paint us to be exactly that. Like, we're just going to embrace that. And over time, the sort of notion that is sometimes felt by, again, people I shouldn't say incorrectly wielding the torch. They're not wielding the correct torch. We'll basically say, like, directly or indirectly. Now, we have to be careful because some men project this onto the messages they receive. Some people send perfect messages about the challenging masculinity, but they'll hear it through another lens. So bear that in mind. But the message in general is often like, men are bad, masculinity is bad, it's toxic, get the hell out of my face, go fix it, do better, come back to me when you're fixed. Now, again, there's a very minority of people who are actually legitimately saying that. And oftentimes there's these sort of inadvertent messaging. And remember what I just said, some men project that onto messaging. Just because somebody's challenging you doesn't mean that they're calling you a piece of trash. But it is floating around a little bit. And it just, when you think about the human psyche, it's hard for people not to get defensive when that's kind of the frame. Now, remember my central first point is like, it's rightful challenging, and men need to rise to the occasion. Anybody who embraces masculinity needs to rise to the occasion, and we need to be like really considering what is healthy masculinity. And at the same time, like damning and kind of creating a leper out of masculinity is not going to be helpful. I mean, there's just no way that identities are challenged healthily through shame. Like that should be obvious to anybody. Like, even if men, and thereby masculinity, have been the wielders of power for the longest of time, the path towards redemption is not shame. It cannot be shame. That's not how that works. Like, there can be an initial shaming of like, how could you, right? Like, you need to rectify. You need to not rectify. You need to kind of come to terms with. And so there can be a staunchness at first. But the path towards actual meaningful sustained shame cannot be paved in did I just say shame? Meaningful change cannot be paved in shame. Does that rhyme? Shame, pain? No. Anyway. So what are we going for here? What could be helpful? I mean, one, I think, is this, gender is such a charged topic right now, which, it's mostly stupid. I'm just going to say it. It's mostly stupid. Any kid goes through their own sort of identity crisis. You're going to hear in my next episode, my own journey is colored by masculinity and femininity both. It's just kind of natural. And so when, kids talk about gender identity these days, they're just exploring this aspect of self more freely than past generations were allowed to. And 99 out of 100 times, they find their way to who they want to be, and there's literally no problem with it. And so it's just weird that it's become such a charged concept, when in reality, if I could distill it, and I'm not trying to be insulting to differing gender identities, but if we distilled it to a very simple form, is all human beings, because of how powerful this yin and yang is in all of us, masculinity versus femininity and anywhere in between, we're all encountering this throughout our lives. Gender is around us all the time. We are observing and noticing the constructs of gender all the time. And so it is inevitable that no matter who you are encountering what masculinity means to you and what femininity means to you, and how you identify with each of those. It's a guarantee. It's a 1,000% guarantee. I can guarantee you that you have encountered this. And if we just think more flexibly about, like, we all have masculinity in us, we all have femininity in us, and we're all trying to find out what that balance looks like for us and how we express it. And there's no right or wrong to any of it. And at the end of the day, most people kind of gravitate more towards one than the other. And that's okay. There's no big deal with that. So that's kind of step one, is just like getting away from this like fear reaction around gender and fear reaction around masculinity and femininity. They both have assets. They absolutely do. But that leads me to point number 2. And that is, maybe we need to do a better job as a society wrapping around men and wrapping around masculinity. And I say that in that order because men are going to be the primary driving forces of changes to masculinity, because remember, the history, the nature of masculinity is more centered around men. It is. There are absolutely women who have more masculine personalities. Absolutely nothing wrong with that. But we're talking stats here. Men are going to be the first and most important game changers when it comes to redefining masculinity. But everybody can contribute. And so maybe as a society, we need to treat this more seriously. We need to actually help each other have these conversations. I mean, this is why I'm doing this entire series, is like, we need to start talking about this. And like, we need to just rip off the Band-Aid and not worry about offending or worry about like, oh gosh, somebody's going to mistake this, because we have not succeeded. It has been decades of this conversation entering the fray, and we are not making, in my opinion, reasonable progress. And I think one of the greatest ironies is if we caricaturize masculinity, and particularly men, and say like, well, they're kind of emotionally not very intelligent, and relationally they tend not to do a very good job, or they're oversimplified relationships. And then we tell them, okay, so go off on your own and figure yourself out in isolation from other people. How do we think that's going to go? I'm going to answer that. It's not going to go terribly far. And it's this brutal irony. It's just like, well, you don't know how to access your emotions. You don't know how to relate terribly effectively to people. So, I'm sure on your own, you're going to find yourself emotionally and relationally. Or I'm going to gather a bunch of say men together, and hope that they will find a way to be emotional with one another and relate with one another more healthily. I don't think that's how that's gonna work. There needs to be more public discourse. This is the whole idea behind diversity and the benefits of diversity in human existence, is when we are around people who are different from one another, And remembering that we're relational creatures, everything that we do and how we define ourselves is dependent upon observing other people in the world. You cannot do this solely in isolation. I mean, you can do initial work and self-reflection and lots of important things, but at the end of the day, you need other people, and not just all the same people together, to figure out what masculinity looks like and what it can look like for a variety of people. So, that's kind of my, if I was to be in the receiving end, right? Like if I just kind of step back from me, doing this episode and say, that's the dialectic I hold, is I will accept responsibility. I have had to accept responsibility in my life for how I encounter masculinity, and I have to find my own version of it. And there's plenty of resources out there of how to encounter it more healthily and more diversely. Yet my retort and my simultaneous ask back to society is, and I could use some help. I've always needed the help. I haven't had the help. A lot of this journey has been on my own. It has been a journey in very many ways in isolation. And so that is where I think we could head. Men need to, and masculine people in this world need to just sit down for a minute and think and self-reflect. But that self-reflection has to be followed also with a kind of a greater, more visible wrapping around masculinity and trying to redefine it more intentionally. What is it? There's tons of healthy aspects to it. There absolutely are. But I don't think a lot of people even know what they are, and how to encounter them in ways that don't become toxic. So I think that's where I'll end. Hopefully that makes sense. Again, the history has got us into this mess. We find ourselves at an interesting crossroads, and within that crossroads, we've been rightfully challenged, and masculinity has been rightfully challenged. Yet simultaneously, masculinity needs help, and it cannot be helped solely by the people who define themselves with a lens or through a lens of masculinity. We need help from everybody, much like feminism and femininity is being redefined, and there's a collective kind of effort towards that. It's still experiencing resistance, of course, and that's not a good thing. But we need to be mindful that with the feminist mindset, maybe, just maybe, multiple aspects of gender and thereby masculinity and femininity, they all need redefined. We can redefine them simultaneously. Heaven forbid, we can do both. We can do both. I will say the one little caveat to that is, if we're not careful, what patriarchal systems will do is they will refocus, and it will not be an equitable focus on masculinity and femininity. All of a sudden, it becomes a reactionary focus on masculinity, and then femininity fades away out of the discourse. And so do not mishear me. I'm not saying oh yeah, there's going to be no problems if we try to collapse around and kind of support masculinity, that we won't continue to have problems with equity. Because the fighting for this sort of discourse for women has been a much longer journey than it has been for men. So please don't mishear me. But I promise you, we can do both. We gotta get better as a society of handling multiple things at the same time. Otherwise, we just have this kind of yo-yo effect, this pendulum that just keeps kind of swinging back and forth, and that's not terribly helpful. So that's definitely it. Again, I think the next episode I'm going to share a little bit about my history, my background, in case it's helpful. But yeah, as always, I appreciate you listening or watching, and stay curious.